Have you ever had a moment so still, so subtle that you almost missed it, but it changed everything? Not with fireworks, not with a grand revelation, but with something quieter, like a whisper that reaches you before the world starts speaking again. That's where transformation begins, not in the noise, but in the silence you've been avoiding. Most of us live our entire lives chasing something. Success, love, approval, stability. We run, we strive, we push against life trying to mold it into our idea of happiness. But the truth is, what we're looking for isn't found by chasing. It's found by stopping, by turning inward, by letting go. It sounds simple, but letting go. It's one of the hardest things we'll ever try to do, because we're not just holding onto people or possessions. We're holding onto stories, old hurts, unspoken fears, false identities we've worn for decades. And Buddhism understood this centuries ago. The Buddha didn't give us a doctrine to memorize. He gave us tools to awaken, not just to see things clearly, but to live with a clarity so deep it untangles even our deepest attachments. Imagine this. You're sitting by a still lake. The surface is perfectly smooth. But the moment a thought enters, I need to fix this, I should have done better, why did they leave? The ripples start. One leads to another, and before you know it, the entire lake is disturbed. Most of us live in those ripples, rarely noticing the stillness underneath. But what if? You didn't need to chase peace. What if peace was already there, beneath everything, just waiting for you to see it? That's the quiet shift. It's not about adding more to your life. It's about seeing what was already there once the distractions fall away. You won't need to run anymore. You won't need to keep proving or pretending. You'll just be, and somehow that will be more than enough. But don't mistake this for passivity. This isn't about giving up, it's about waking up. There's a world inside you that's been ignored for too long, and the moment you stop feeding the noise, you'll start hearing it. This series is not about philosophy. It's not even just about Buddhism. It's about you, your mind, your suffering, your freedom. Each chapter ahead isn't a lecture. It's a lantern. It's a gentle guide leading you back to the part of yourself you forgot, but have been longing to return to. We'll explore how negative thoughts twist reality, why anger is never really about them, but always about what's unresolved in us. We'll expose the silent patterns that make people underestimate you, and the calm power that commands respect without raising your voice. We'll learn the truth about emotional mastery, how real peace doesn't mean you feel nothing, but that nothing owns you. And as we go deeper, you'll begin to feel it, not just understand it, like a soft bell ringing inside you, even as the world shouts louder outside. You'll begin to see why monks smile without needing anything, why silence heals more than arguments ever could, why true strength never needs to fight, and why letting go isn't the end, but the beginning of everything that matters. So take a breath, not a shallow one, a real breath, the kind you feel in your chest and bones. Because from this moment, everything shifts, not in dramatic ways, but in the only way that lasts. Subtle, still, undeniable. The path has already begun. And in the stillness, your mind is about to meet something it hasn't felt in a long time: freedom. There's a moment in every wise person's life when they realize, not everyone deserves access to them. Not everyone should sit at your table. Not everyone has earned the right to walk through the inner chambers of your peace, your time, your mind. Yet for years, maybe decades, you've handed out access like it was nothing. Because you cared. Because you didn't want to hurt anyone. Because you believed that being available equaled being kind. But let's face it, the more access you give, the more they take. And slowly they drain you. Imagine your energy as a sacred well, deep, life-giving, but not infinite. Every interaction, every phone call, every obligation, every unfiltered presence in your life, it takes a sip. Some take gulps, and some drink as if they own the well. You know the ones. The friend who only calls when they need something. The relative who's always in a crisis, yet never asks how you're doing. The colleague who offloads their emotional mess on you, then walks away lighter, leaving you heavy. It's subtle at first. You justify it. They're going through a tough time. They don't have anyone else. But days become weeks. Weeks become years. And suddenly you're exhausted, and you can't figure out why. This chapter is your wake-up call. It's time to reclaim your energy by withdrawing access from those who never earned it, or who have long stopped appreciating it. Let's be clear. This isn't cruelty. This is clarity. This is not about becoming cold. It's about becoming conscious. You don't owe unlimited access to people just because you once loved them, or because they share your blood, or because they've always been around. Loyalty without boundaries leads to burnout. Compassion without caution leads to collapse. You can be kind and still say, no more. Start noticing who leaves you drained after a conversation, and who leaves you inspired. Who adds to your peace, and who fractures it. Who respects your space, and who invades it without a second thought. Buddhism speaks of wise attention, a kind of inner discernment that sees clearly where our energy flows and whether it flows into wisdom or delusion. The Buddha never encouraged blind compassion. He spoke often about the company we keep, how it shapes the very direction of our lives. So here's a radical question you must ask yourself. If your energy is a sacred gift, who actually deserves to receive it? Because not everyone does. Start with subtle shifts. Mute the notifications from the person who never says anything meaningful. Stop replying out of guilt. End conversations that loop into the same complaints and never evolve. You are not a dumping ground for unresolved emotions. You are a temple. This isn't about cutting people off cold. It's about managing proximity. Some people are safe to love from a distance. Others need to be moved from the front row of your life to the balcony. And a few, with deep respect, must be shown the exit. It's not selfish, it's sacred. And when you do this, something astonishing happens. That fatigue you thought was age, it lifts. That sense of irritability you blamed on stress, it fades. That dull heaviness that followed you, it begins to dissolve. Why? Because you've finally closed the leaks. You've stopped hemorrhaging energy through connections that were not aligned with your growth. You've reclaimed your power, not with anger but with awareness. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone. Your peace speaks louder than your defense. Your serenity is the proof that you're walking the right path. And as you begin to take back your energy, something beautiful happens. You start to notice how much more you have to give to the right people. The ones who honor your presence, who listen when you speak, who hold space without agenda, who don't just take, but give in silence and in sincerity. Suddenly, your circle may get smaller, but your life becomes richer. And from that space, free of constant noise, manipulation, and emotional taxation, you begin to feel something you might have forgotten. Stillness, strength, clarity. And when you stand in that sacred clarity, you start to see something else. One of the most powerful truths that will transform how you move through life. Not everything deserves your reaction. That realization is the foundation for what comes next. In a world addicted to noise, silence becomes a superpower. We live in a time where everyone seems to be talking, online, on the phone, in meetings, in their own heads, constantly filling the space with commentary, judgments, and opinions. But rarely do people stop to observe, to really see, to fully feel what's happening beneath the surface of their surroundings or within themselves. And this is where true transformation begins, not in more speaking, but in deeper seeing. You see, the Zen tradition has long emphasized that awareness, pure, direct, unfiltered awareness. is the gateway to wisdom. Not the kind of awareness that comes with overthinking or labeling, but the simple, grounded attentiveness that arises when you get quiet enough to witness life as it is. When you speak less, something extraordinary happens. Your mind stops rehearsing what to say next and starts noticing what's right in front of you. You begin to notice how a person's eyes shift when they're hiding pain. You begin to sense the tension in a room before anyone utters a word. You begin to feel your own breath, how it rises and falls like waves on a quiet shore. And slowly, you realize, awareness is not something you do, it's something you return to. It's a state of presence that was always there, buried beneath the noise. But let's be honest, silence can be terrifying for many people. Because in silence, the truth has nowhere to hide. The things we've been avoiding, our insecurities, our fears, our loneliness, they all begin to surface when the chatter stops. That's why most people fill the void with more words, more distractions, more control. But Zen invites you to do the opposite, to sit with the silence, to watch without judging, to listen without needing to respond. Because within that sacred stillness, you begin to remember. You remember that most of life's answers come not from reacting, but from observing. Think of the Zen masters, those quiet sages who rarely speak unless absolutely necessary. Their power doesn't lie in their words, but in their presence. People would travel across countries just to sit in silence with them. Why? Because their silence spoke louder than 1,000 lectures. Their stillness carried a frequency that reached beyond logic, directly into the soul. And here's something you've probably noticed too. When someone truly sees you, even if they say nothing, you feel it. That's the gift of awareness. You don't need to convince anyone, correct anyone, or control any situation. You just need to see clearly. And when you do, life stops being a performance and becomes a meditation. Now let me tell you something that's going to sound paradoxical. Silence is not the opposite of communication, it's the foundation of it. When you speak less, your words begin to carry weight. People listen more carefully. Your presence becomes magnetic not because you're louder, but because you're deeper. And in a world full of noise, depth is rare. Depth is sacred. You'll start to notice this shift in the smallest ways. A conversation that used to drain you now becomes a chance to observe human patterns. A moment of boredom becomes an invitation to study your breath. A silent walk in nature begins to feel like communion with the divine. And with time, your intuition sharpens. You stop needing to ask, "What should I do?" Because the answer reveals itself naturally, like the reflection of the moon on a still lake. This is why Zen monks sweep floors, pour tea, or arrange stones in gardens. Not because these acts are mundane, but because they are mirrors. Every action, when done with awareness, becomes a doorway to awakening. So if you want to live a more peaceful, powerful, and intuitive life, speak less. Observe more. Feel deeply, and trust the awareness that arises in stillness more than the noise that erupts in urgency. Because it's not about saying the right things, it's about seeing what is. And once you do, everything changes, not because you forced it, but because you finally noticed what was always there. Have you ever wondered why some people seem to carry a quiet strength with them, even when no one is watching? They walk into a room without saying a word, and yet somehow the atmosphere shifts. That presence, dignified, composed, magnetic, doesn't come from titles, wealth, or applause. It is born in the solitude of their private moments, where self-respect is nurtured like a sacred flame. You see, the way we treat ourselves when no one's around is the clearest reflection of who we truly are. It's not the curated Instagram posts or the polished conversations in public that reveal our character. It's what we do in the silence. Do we speak to ourselves with kindness or criticism? Do we keep our promises to ourselves or only to others? Do we show discipline or do we crumble the moment no one's watching? Zen teaches us that our inner world creates our outer world. If you hold yourself in low regard in private, no amount of external validation can fix that hollow feeling inside. True dignity arises when your actions align with your values, when you respect your time, your body, your thoughts, and your silence. This isn't about being rigid. It's about being intentional. Even something as simple as making your bed, choosing nourishing food, or turning off the noise to sit in mindful stillness. These small acts build the architecture of inner respect. And here's the profound truth. When you respect yourself in private, the world begins to mirror that respect back to you. People treat you how you subconsciously teach them to. If you allow your inner dialogue to be full of shame or self-loathing, that energy leaks out through your posture, your choices, even your tone. But when your internal space becomes sacred, when your thoughts toward yourself are calm and reverent, you develop a glow that no external approval can give, and none can take away. There is a Zen phrase: when the mind is still, the universe surrenders. But that stillness only arrives when we stop disrespecting ourselves with distractions, guilt, and self-betrayal. It means not forcing yourself to fit into places that drain your peace. It means not gossiping even when it's easy. It means choosing quality over chaos, solitude over noise, growth over instant gratification. And this doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. You reclaim your dignity in the choices you make when no one will ever know about them. You protect your soul not by building walls, but by setting gentle, invisible boundaries. You speak kindly to yourself, even when you fail. You allow your inner world to be a sanctuary, not a battlefield. This is the art of self-respect that Zen quietly urges us toward, not for the sake of image, but for the sake of peace. Because when the foundation of dignity is strong, you don't need to seek validation. You radiate truth. And in a world that often rewards loudness and chaos, your quiet self-respect becomes an unshakable form of power. And the more you cultivate that dignity within, something interesting happens. You become less reactive, less desperate, less afraid. Your silence becomes strength. Your solitude becomes sacred, and your presence, calm, kind, unwavering, begins to change every room you enter. Now let's go even deeper. There's another silent discipline that amplifies this inner dignity in ways most people overlook. It's not about what you say or don't say. It's about how you listen. There's an unspoken language you carry with you, your energy. It enters the room before you speak. It shapes how others treat you, not because of what you demand, but because of what you embody. This isn't about arrogance or creating invisible walls. It's about setting a silent standard, one that's anchored in self-worth. You don't teach people how to treat you by lecturing them. You show them with how you live, how you move, and most importantly, what you no longer entertain. Imagine your energy as a frequency, like a radio signal. Some people will naturally tune into you, feel your calm, your clarity, your strength. Others, vibrating in chaos, manipulation, or negativity, will fumble to connect, and that's not your problem to fix. When your frequency is high, when it's rooted in peace, integrity, and self-respect, you don't have to push people away. They remove themselves. But here's the catch. This only works when you are consistent. A standard isn't a one-time decision. It's a rhythm you walk in every day. If you allow disrespect once, tolerate half-hearted connections, or betray your own needs to keep the peace, you lower the filter. You open the gates. And once open, your energy becomes the playground for those who don't deserve access. Setting the standard begins with the choices you make when no one's watching. How do you speak to yourself in your mind? What kind of conversations do you allow in your space? Do you accept company out of loneliness, or do you sit in silence until someone aligned with your peace arrives? These are your filters. They decide the flow of your life. In Zen, the concept of mindful boundaries is deeply respected. You don't control others, but you can refine yourself so well that only those in resonance remain. There's a serenity in becoming unshakable, not from force, but from alignment. When you carry dignity in your actions, you stop asking for bare minimum treatment. When you radiate clarity, confusion stops knocking. When you live with purpose, chaos loses interest. You don't need to chase connection when your energy is a magnet, but you must become the kind of person whose energy reflects the life you want. Want deep respect. Respect yourself first, especially in moments of doubt. Want loyalty. Be loyal to your own growth. Want peace. Stop entertaining what disturbs your inner world, no matter how familiar it feels. Your vibration becomes your filter when you finally accept that not everyone is meant to sit at your table, that not every phone call deserves a reply, that not every argument needs your voice. Some things you let go not because they're unimportant, but because you are. And that's where your true power begins, not in what you can demand, but in what you no longer settle for. Let's go deeper, because once you've set the standard, the next step is to protect it. And to do that, you must master the art of disappearing, silently, intentionally, and without a trace of guilt. There's a sacred strength in choosing to walk away, not out of weakness, not in anger, not with noise, but in complete silence. When someone disrespects you, when a situation no longer aligns with your peace, or when a place starts draining your soul, you are under no obligation to stay. You don't owe the world your suffering. You don't need to prove your pain, nor do you have to explain your exit. Walking away with grace is not avoidance, it is mastery. Because real detachment isn't about pushing things away. It's about allowing them to fall away naturally, without you clinging to them as they crumble. You see, the ego wants to stay and fight, to defend itself, to make a scene, to be seen. But the spirit, it seeks peace. It seeks liberation, not justification. And there's a profound kind of wisdom in realizing that not every battle is yours to fight. Not every insult is yours to correct. Not every ending is yours to dramatize. Think of a monk in the Zen tradition. When insulted, he does not argue. When challenged, he does not react. When misunderstood, he lets it pass. Why? Because he knows, the moment you step into the chaos, you become part of it. You begin to absorb its energy, take on its frequency, and before you know it, you're not walking away anymore. You're trapped, dancing to a tune that was never yours. Detachment is the discipline of choosing not to participate in every fire you see. Just because someone hands you a rope doesn't mean you have to tie yourself to their drama. Just because a door is open doesn't mean it leads to somewhere you need to go. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't saying something clever, it's saying nothing at all. It's not about being cold, indifferent, or emotionally numb. It's about being internally anchored. It's about knowing when to speak and when silence says more. It's about recognizing that peace is not found in dominating chaos, but in stepping away from it altogether. And when you learn to walk away without noise, you begin to see the magic of life reorganizing itself around your decision. The wrong people fall away, the draining circumstances dissolve, and the energy that once leaked from your soul begins to return to you. You start to move through the world not as someone who constantly reacts, but as someone who deeply chooses. That's real power. To walk away without the need to be understood. To walk away not because you're giving up, but because you're leveling up. To walk away without slamming the door because the door no longer holds you. In this stillness, in this act of gentle departure, you become a storm in reverse. Quiet, calm, unshakable, and the beauty of it all. You don't even need applause because your reward is peace. Your reward is dignity. Your reward is freedom. And freedom, as the Buddha taught, begins not with gaining more, but with releasing what never truly belonged. Now, imagine this quiet clarity extending even deeper, not just in your actions, but in your very perception of people and life itself. There's a kind of strength that doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't stomp its feet. It doesn't retaliate or explain. It doesn't chase after being understood or seen. It simply remains still, rooted, unmoved. In a noisy world where everyone is desperate to be heard, to be right, to defend, to clap back, silence has become a lost art. And yet, it's one of the most powerful tools of the Zen way. Because silence, when wielded with presence and purpose, isn't emptiness. It's clarity. You see, silence isn't weakness. It's restraint. It's inner mastery. It's the ability to not need to prove anything to anyone. When someone insults you, mocks you, betrays you, or tries to draw you into their drama, your silence doesn't mean you didn't notice. It means you've risen above the battlefield. Reaction is what they want from you. Silence is what they can't handle. Let's take a moment to remember the teaching of the Buddha. Those who are wise do not speak to win arguments. They speak to bring peace. But the deeper level of wisdom is this. Sometimes the greatest peace comes from not speaking at all. Think of a still pond. The clearer it is, the more it reflects the sky. But the more you throw stones into it, the more it ripples, the more it distorts. That's your mind. That's your inner self. Every reaction is a stone. Every silence is stillness. Now let me ask you something. How many times have you felt the urge to reply to a message just to defend yourself? How many sleepless nights have you spent overanalyzing what someone said, preparing the perfect comeback in your head? And how many times did reacting actually make anything better? You see, most people don't actually want understanding. They want control. They want chaos. They want to trigger you because your reaction gives them validation, power, relevance. When you remain silent, when you observe instead of absorb, you shift the dynamic entirely. You disarm them. You expose their noise for what it is, noise. In Zen, the master often answers questions with silence, not to confuse, but to let the student confront their own mind. Silence makes people uncomfortable because it's a mirror. It forces them to face their own emotions without distraction. And most people aren't ready for that level of raw honesty. But here's the secret. Silence isn't just something you use with others. It's something you practice with yourself. Silencing the urge to criticize yourself. Silencing the voice that tells you you're not good enough, fast enough, smart enough. Silencing the addiction to noise, stimulation, validation. When you stop reacting, something incredible happens. You start hearing again. Not the external world, but your inner truth. And let's be clear, choosing not to react doesn't mean you're passive. It means you're selective. It means you've decided not to let someone else control your nervous system. You've decided your peace is more important than proving a point. Even in nature, the fiercest storms don't last. And when they pass, it's always the silent trees that still stand. So the next time someone tries to draw you into chaos, breathe deeply. Return to your center. Don't react. Don't explain. Don't justify. Let your stillness speak louder than their noise. Let your silence become the loudest voice in the room. And as you master this subtle art, you'll find a strange and beautiful thing happening. People will start to treat you differently. Not because you shouted for respect, but because your silence commanded it. There's a quiet confidence in those who no longer chase. They move through life with ease, not because life is easy, but because they've stopped fighting the current. They don't beg for attention, validation, or love. They've learned the secret. What's meant for them will never have to be chased. In a world that screams hustle, grind, and go get it, the idea of not chasing seems counterintuitive, lazy even. But in Zen, stillness is not laziness. It is power held inward rather than thrown outward. When you live in alignment, your energy speaks before you do. You no longer need to convince the world of your worth. Your presence does it for you. Chasing comes from lack. You chase success when you feel unsuccessful. You chase love when you feel unlovable. You chase approval when you doubt your own path. But have you noticed? The more desperately you run after something, the further it seems to go. That's not coincidence. That's misalignment. Alignment is when your inner world and outer actions are in harmony. You think clearly, you act calmly, you rest deeply, you speak only when your words add value. You say no without guilt and yes without fear. And in that state you attract, not because of manipulation, but because of magnetism. Zen Buddhism teaches that the more you cling, the more you suffer. It's not that you shouldn't desire good things. It's that your attachment to the outcome becomes your prison. Desire by itself is not the issue. It's the obsession, the burning need for control that disrupts your peace. Let go and life often gives you more than what you tried so hard to take. Take the lotus flower. It does not bloom by effort. It rises gently through the mud, reaching for the sun not because it tries, but because it's aligned with what it is. You are no different. You don't need to become louder. You need to become clearer. Clarity is more attractive than charm. Peace is more powerful than persuasion. Living in alignment means knowing your values and living them. You don't flirt with people you don't want a future with. You don't compromise your boundaries to gain temporary comfort. You don't pretend to be someone you're not to gain shallow approval. You stay true to your principles, even when it's inconvenient. Because that consistency, that integrity, is what draws in the right people, the right opportunities, and the right energy. Look back at your life. Weren't there moments when you stopped trying and suddenly things fell into place? That's not luck. That's the universe responding to your alignment. When you no longer need something, you're most prepared to receive it. Because neediness creates resistance, while self-sufficiency opens the gate. When you're whole, you stop acting from desperation. You begin to radiate instead of reach. And what you radiate comes back to you tenfold. There's immense magnetism in a person who's not looking to be completed. They're already full. They listen more than they speak. They observe without judgment. They offer without expectation. And they attract, not through effort but through presence. So stop chasing. Don't run after love, success, or attention. Let your energy do the work. Become the type of person that what you desire naturally desires back. You don't need to knock on every door. When you are in alignment, the right ones open by themselves. Now imagine someone walking through life with that energy. Calm, collected, quietly confident. They don't rush. They don't panic, they trust. They know that what's meant for them is already on its way. And when obstacles appear, they don't flail. They respond with grace. Because they understand, life doesn't punish them, it teaches them. Every delay, every rejection, every loss. All part of the realignment. So instead of forcing your way forward, try softening. Instead of proving, try being. Instead of chasing, become the type of person that what you desire can find. And when you finally stop running, you'll hear the quiet whisper that's been guiding you all along. There comes a time in every journey when the storms no longer scare you, not because they've grown weaker, but because you've grown quieter. Not passive, not numb, but rooted deeply, unwaveringly, in your own stillness. In a world that glorifies noise, speed, and constant movement, stillness feels almost rebellious. But it is in this stillness that your real power lies. Because the truth is, the strongest trees don't resist the wind, they bend with it. What keeps them from toppling is not their height or might, but the depth of their roots. And just like those trees, you too must grow downward before you rise upward. Your unshakable core begins with stillness. Not the stillness of idleness, but the stillness of presence. The kind that listens before speaking, feels before reacting, sees beyond appearances. A stillness that observes the chaos without becoming it. That knows how to pause, not out of fear, but out of clarity. You see, the reason most people feel so easily knocked off center is because they build their identity on things that move. Status, opinions, validation, appearance. When those things shift, their sense of self collapses with them. But when you build your core on stillness, you're no longer at the mercy of the outside world. People may misunderstand you. Situations may disappoint you. Life may surprise you. But nothing can truly uproot you, because you're not holding on to anything that isn't truly yours. Stillness doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing from a place of centeredness. It means your action is rooted in clarity, not impulse. Your decisions are guided by awareness, not pressure. Your boundaries come from self-respect, not reaction. And what's beautiful is when you build from stillness, everything you create carries that peace with it. Your words soothe instead of stir. Your presence calms instead of overwhelms. People feel safer around you, not because you're loud, but because you're stable, grounded, real. Stillness also teaches you what to ignore. Because when you're truly anchored within, you no longer need to win every argument, explain every choice, or prove every point. You're too focused on peace to get distracted by noise. Think of a candle in a windless room. It doesn't flicker. It just glows. That's what your spirit becomes in stillness. Radiant, undisturbed, undeniably powerful. And here's the truth: you can't fake stillness. It's something you cultivate in silence, in solitude, in the honest moments when you face your own chaos and choose not to feed it. You let your emotions rise and fall like waves, but you remain the ocean, vast, deep, unshaken. To build an unshakable core, you don't have to control the world. You only need to stop letting it control you. And once that happens, you begin to live differently. You're no longer waiting for people to understand you, to include you, or to validate your worth. You've already given yourself that permission. And from that place, everything changes. You move through life with intention. You love with depth. You detach with grace. You protect your peace, not out of fear of losing it, but out of reverence for how hard you've worked to build it. Stillness becomes your home. Not because the world outside is quiet, but because the storm within has finally passed. And when you're rooted in that kind of stillness, you no longer chase balance. You are the balance. Now, from this solid ground, there's one final shift to make. One that doesn't come from effort, but from alignment. A magnetic truth that changes everything, not by force, but by flow. You've been silent. You've withdrawn your energy from chaos. You've built a core that doesn't tremble when the world shakes. And now, you don't need to shout. You don't need to prove. You become the storm, not the one that destroys, but the one that awakens. True power doesn't announce itself. It moves with quiet precision. It doesn't ask permission. It simply is. Just like the eye of a hurricane, still, centered, yet everything around it shifts. You don't need to argue, to chase, or to convince anyone of your worth. You exist in your fullness, and your very presence rewrites the room. When you've walked the path of stillness long enough, you no longer fear losing people who don't see your value. You no longer attach your worth to who chooses to stay. You stop playing by the rules of noise and urgency. Instead, you radiate peace, and that peace becomes power. They never saw you coming because you didn't force your way into anyone's view. You rose quietly. You healed silently. You aligned intentionally. And now you are untouchable. Not because you built walls, but because you grew roots so deep that storms don't scare you anymore. Being the storm is not about chaos. It's about clarity. It's about standing tall in a world of noise and not being shaken. It's about knowing when to walk away, when to hold silence, and when to let your energy speak louder than words ever could. So, be the storm, not to destroy, but to disrupt what no longer serves, to wake up those who are asleep, to remind the world that power, true power, is found in inner stillness. And if something in your heart stirred during this journey, if even one line made you feel seen, grounded, or whole again, this is your space. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. This channel is here for those who seek truth not in noise but in presence, who want to live deeply, simply, and wisely. Together, let's walk the path of stillness in a world that never stops spinning. One quiet storm at a time. Breathe in, breathe out. You're exactly where you need to be.